300 Apache warriors, all of them staring at Thaddeus Whitmore's ranch house through the morning mist, their war paint gleaming in the early sunlight, their horses snorting clouds of steam in the cold desert air, and every single one of them had a reason to want him dead. But 12 hours earlier, Thad had been just another bitter rancher trying to forget the war that took his leg and his faith in humanity. The sun was setting over his small cattle operation in Arizona territory when he heard the gunshots echoing from Eagles Canyon. Most folks would have ignored it. Smart folks would have locked their doors and pretended they heard nothing. But something about those shots, desperate, scattered like someone fighting for their life, made Thad grab his rifle and ride toward trouble. He found the young Apache warrior face down in the dirt, 3 bullet wounds painting his buckskin shirt crimson. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the desert sand. The kid couldn't have been more than 22, and by the look of the ceremonial beadwork on his clothes, he wasn't just any warrior. This was someone important. Thad's first instinct was to turn around, leave the Indian to die like so many others had done. Hell, most white folks in these parts would have put another bullet in him just to be sure. The Apache had been raiding settlements all summer, and the hatred ran deep on both sides. But when the young man's eyes fluttered open and looked straight at him, not with fear or anger but with a strange kind of recognition, something inside Thad's chest cracked open. The warrior tried to speak, blood bubbling from his lips. He managed one word in broken English before his head fell back to the sand. "Please." Thad stared down at him, his finger twitching on the rifle trigger. Every rational thought told him to ride away. This Apache was probably responsible for burning out the Morrison family last month. Could have been part of the war party that attacked the stagecoach near Tombstone. But looking at the kid bleeding out in the dirt, all Thad could see was another young soldier dying far from home. He made his choice. Thad holstered his rifle, dismounted, and hoisted the wounded Apache onto his horse. The ride back to his ranch felt like the longest mile of his life, every shadow in the rocks looking like it might hide a war party ready to fill him with arrows. But he got the Apache to his cabin, laid him on his own bed, and started cleaning the wounds. The bullets had missed the vital organs, but the blood loss was severe. As Thad worked by lamplight, cutting away the shirt and applying pressure to the wounds, he noticed something that made his hands freeze. Around the young warrior's neck hung a small leather pouch, and inside it was a photograph, cracked and faded, but unmistakable. It showed a white woman and a young Apache boy, maybe 8 years old. The woman had her hand on the boy's shoulder, and both were smiling at the camera. Thad's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen mixed families before, but this was different. This photograph meant something. It meant this Apache had connections to the white world. It meant he wasn't just a raider. He was someone caught between 2 worlds, just like Thad himself had been after the war. As dawn broke over the desert, Thad managed to stop the bleeding and get some water into the unconscious warrior. He was cleaning his hands in a basin when he heard it, the sound that made his blood turn to ice. War drums, distant but unmistakable, echoing across the desert from the direction of Apache territory. But what chilled him to the bone wasn't just the drums themselves. It was the pattern of the drum beats that made Thad's hands shake as he reached for his rifle. 3 short beats, then 4 long ones, then silence. He'd heard that pattern before, during his cavalry days along the Colorado River. It wasn't a war call or a hunting signal. It was a death song. Someone important had gone missing, and the Apache were mourning. The wounded warrior stirred on the bed, his eyes opening slowly. When he saw Thad standing over him with a rifle, he didn't flinch. Instead, he whispered something in Apache, then switched to English. "My father. He looks for me. Your father." Thad's voice was barely a whisper. "Chief Running Elk of the White Mountain Band. I am Nalnish. You call me Running Bear." The young man struggled to sit up, pressing a hand to his bandaged ribs. "I was riding to meet with Colonel Hayes. Peace talk. Make treaty." Thad felt the floor drop out from under him. A peace envoy. He'd saved a peace envoy. Which meant the Apache weren't just looking for any missing warrior. They were looking for the chief's son, who was supposed to be negotiating an end to the fighting. "Jesus Christ," Thad muttered, sinking into his chair. "Do you know what this means? If your people think the whites killed you during a peace mission, war." Running Bear finished for him. "Bad war. My father. He trusts no white man now." The drums grew louder, closer. Thad could hear them coming from multiple directions now. North, south, and east. They were being surrounded, and he was sitting in his cabin with the one person who could either save them all or get them killed. Running Bear tried to stand, then collapsed back onto the bed with a grunt of pain. I must go to them, tell them I live. You can barely sit up. Boy, you take 3 steps outside and you'll bleed to death before you make it to the porch. Then you take me. Thad laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to ride out there with you? A white man carrying a wounded Apache warrior. They'll fill us both with arrows before we get close enough to explain. Maybe. Or maybe they listen. Running Bear's dark eyes fixed on Thad's face. Why you help me? You know who I am now. You know what happened if my father think whites kill his son. It was a fair question, and Thad didn't have a good answer. He looked at the photograph still lying on the bedside table. The white woman and the Apache boy. Who's the woman in the picture? Running Bear's expression softened. My mother, Sarah Mackenzie. She was teacher at mission school. Fell in love with Apache warrior who become my father. She teach me English, teach me about white man's world before the sickness take her. And your father let her? My father loved her, but when she die, his heart turned cold toward whites. He say white man's diseases kill his woman, white man's bullets kill his people. Only reason he agreed to peace talk is because... Running Bear paused, as if weighing whether to continue. Because what? Because I tell him there are good white men. Men who see Apache as people, not animals. Men like the one who saved his son's life. The drums stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence that felt more threatening than the noise had been. Thad moved to the window and peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. What he saw made his stomach drop. Riders. At least 50 of them moving in perfect formation across the desert toward his ranch. Even at this distance, he could see the war paint and feathers, the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels and tomahawk blades. They're coming, he whispered. Running Bear struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. How many? More than I can count. Your father doesn't take chances, does he? He cannot afford to. Too many of our people have died trusting white men. Running Bear managed to walk to the window, though each step left a dark spot of blood on the wooden floor. When he looked outside, his face went pale. This is not search party, he said quietly. This is war party. But before Thad could ask what that meant, they heard something that made both men freeze. The sound of hoofbeats. But not from the Apache war party approaching from the desert. These were coming from behind the ranch house, from the direction of town. Thad cursed under his breath and moved to the back window. Through the morning haze, he could see another group of riders approaching fast. White men, at least 20 of them, led by Sheriff Marcus Dalton and Deputy Will Hendricks. They were armed to the teeth and riding hard like men heading into battle. No, 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 Thad muttered, his worst nightmare unfolding before his eyes. The townspeople must have heard the drums and seen the Apache moving across the desert. Now they were coming to help defend his ranch, which meant, white men coming too, Running Bear observed, his voice heavy with resignation. Now both sides come here to fight. This is a disaster, Thad said, grabbing his rifle and checking the ammunition. Your people are going to think I called for backup. My people are going to think you're here to scout for an attack. Running Bear leaned against the window frame, blood seeping through his bandages. When they meet, many will die. Good men on both sides. The Apache war party had stopped about 300 yards from the ranch house, forming a curved line that stretched from north to south. Through his field glasses, Thad could see Chief Running Elk himself, a tall, imposing figure on a paint horse, his face streaked with black and red war paint. The chief was scanning the ranch buildings, looking for any sign of his son. Behind them, Sheriff Dalton's posse was closing fast, dust clouds marking their approach. In maybe 10 minutes, both groups would be within shooting range of each other, with Thad's ranch house sitting squarely in the middle. There's got to be a way out of this, Thad said, more to himself than to Running Bear. Some way to let both sides know what really happened before they start killing each other. White flag, Running Bear suggested weakly. I go out with white flag, tell my father I'm safe. You can barely stand, and a white flag won't stop bullets if someone gets trigger happy. Thad paced the small cabin, his limp more pronounced when he was agitated. Besides, your own people might not recognize you from that distance. What if they think I'm forcing you out there as a human shield? Running Bear was quiet for a moment, then said something that made Thad's blood run cold. My father, he will not wait long. If he think whites have killed his son. What? What will he do? He will signal the other bands. Mescalero from south, Chiricahua from west. They all wait for word from him about peace talks. Thad stared at him. How many warriors are we talking about? Maybe 1,000. Maybe more. The weight of that number hit Thad like a physical blow. 1,000 Apache warriors, united in war against the white settlements. Every ranch, every town, every family between here and Tucson would be wiped out, all because he'd made the decision to save one wounded young man. Through the front window, he could see the Apache war party beginning to spread out, positioning themselves for what looked like an attack formation. Chief Running Elk had raised his rifle above his head, some kind of signal that made the other warriors start checking their weapons. From the back window, Sheriff Dalton's men were maybe 5 minutes away, riding hard and ready for a fight. Running Bear closed his eyes, swaying on his feet. "You should not have saved me, white man. Now you die for kindness." But Thad was studying the photograph again, the image of Running Bear's white mother and her Apache son. An idea was forming in his mind. Dangerous, probably suicidal, but maybe their only chance. "That photograph," he said suddenly. "Does your father know about it? Does he know you carry your mother's picture?" "Yes. He give it to me when I become warrior. Say it remind me that love can exist between our peoples." "Then maybe," Thad began, but his words were cut off by a sound that made both men's hearts stop. A gunshot, not from the ranch, but from somewhere between the two approaching groups. The single gunshot echoed across the desert like thunder, and suddenly everything changed. Thad watched through his field glasses as the Apache war party exploded into motion. Warriors kicking their horses forward and raising their weapons. Chief Running Elk's face twisted with rage as he pointed toward Sheriff Dalton's approaching posse. "Someone fired early," Thad whispered, his stomach sinking. "Some nervous cowboy just started a war." But Running Bear was looking in a different direction, toward a rocky outcrop about halfway between the two groups. "Wait," he said, squinting against the morning sun. "That shot, it not come from your people or mine." Thad swung his glasses toward the rocks and felt his blood turn to ice. There, barely visible behind a boulder, was a flash of blue fabric. Cavalry blue. "Son of a bitch," he breathed. "There's soldiers out there." The pieces suddenly fell into place. Colonel Hayes, the man Running Bear was supposed to meet for peace talks, must have sent a patrol to escort the Apache delegation. But when the shooting started between the townspeople and the war party, the soldiers probably thought they were witnessing an Apache attack on civilians. Another shot cracked across the desert, this time definitely from the cavalry position. Thad could see muzzle flash from behind the rocks as the hidden soldiers opened fire on both groups simultaneously. "They're shooting at everyone," Thad said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The cavalry thinks it's a three-way battle." Chief Running Elk's war cry pierced the morning air as his warriors charged toward the sound of gunfire. From behind the ranch, Sheriff Dalton's men were spurring their horses forward, convinced the Apache were attacking. And somewhere in the rocks, maybe a dozen cavalry troopers were shooting at anything that moved, trying to restore order with bullets. Running Bear grabbed Thad's arm with surprising strength. "You have to stop this. You have to get to my father before—" His words were lost in a sudden eruption of gunfire as all three groups opened up on each other. Bullets whined through the air, horses screamed, and men shouted orders that no one could hear over the chaos. Thad watched in horror as Sheriff Dalton's youngest deputy, Tommy Morrison, fell from his saddle with an Apache arrow in his shoulder. On the other side, a young Apache warrior tumbled from his horse, struck by a cavalry bullet meant for someone else. "This is madness," Thad said, but he was already moving, grabbing his hat and checking his rifle. "I'm going out there. You'll be killed before you take 10 steps, Running Bear protested. "All three sides will shoot you." "Maybe, but if I don't try, we're all dead anyway." Thad looked at the photograph one more time, then handed it to Running Bear. "If something happens to me, you make sure your father sees this. You tell him there was a white man who believed in what your mother taught you." Running Bear struggled to his feet, determination overriding his pain. "Then we go together. You can't even walk straight. I can ride." Thad stared at him. The kid was right. If anyone could get close enough to Chief Running Elk to stop this massacre, it would be his own son. But getting Running Bear onto a horse and across a battlefield filled with flying bullets would be suicide for both of them. The gunfire was intensifying now, and through the smoke and dust, Thad could see men falling on all sides. Sheriff Dalton was shouting orders, trying to pull his men back toward cover. Chief Running Elk had divided his warriors into two groups, one attacking the cavalry position, and another moving to flank the townspeople. In maybe 5 more minutes, this would turn into a full-scale slaughter. If you were Thad, what would you do? Risk everything to ride into that battlefield with a wounded Apache warrior? knowing you'd probably both die before reaching Chief Running Elk? Or stay safe in the cabin and watch as hundreds of good men killed each other over a misunderstanding? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which choice you'd make. Because what Thad decided next would either save 3 peoples from war, or guarantee that none of them would survive to see sunset. Thad made his choice. He threw open the cabin door and ran toward the barn, shouting over his shoulder, "Come on, boy. If we're going to die, let's die trying to do something right." But as they reached the horses, something happened that neither of them had expected. A bugle call pierced through the gunfire, long, clear, and unmistakable. It was the cavalry signal for ceasefire, but it wasn't coming from the rocks where the soldiers were pinned down. It was coming from behind Chief Running Elk's war party. Thad stopped dead in his tracks, his hand on his horse's bridle. Through the dust and smoke, he could see a new group of riders approaching from the north, blue uniforms, guidon flags snapping in the desert wind, and at their head rode a man Thad recognized even at this distance, Colonel William Hayes himself, leading what looked like a full company of cavalry. "The Colonel," Running Bear breathed, leaning heavily against the barn wall. "He comes for peace talks, but now—" The gunfire began to slacken as all 3 groups noticed the approaching cavalry column. Chief Running Elk raised his hand, signaling his warriors to hold their fire and regroup. Sheriff Dalton's men were pulling back toward the ranch buildings, using the momentary lull to tend their wounded and reload. But Colonel Hayes wasn't slowing down. His column was riding hard toward the battlefield, and Thad could see the anger in the man's posture even from this distance. The colonel had come to negotiate peace, only to find his escort patrol trapped in a 3-way gunfight. He's going to think the Apache broke the peace talks, Thad realized. He'll order a full attack. Running Bear nodded grimly. And my father will think the whites planned this trap. Both sides now believe the other betrayed them. As Colonel Hayes's column drew closer, Thad could hear him shouting orders. The cavalry was deploying into battle formation, preparing to charge Chief Running Elk's position. On the other side, the Apache warriors were spreading out along the ridgeline, ready to rain arrows down on anyone who approached. Sheriff Dalton had managed to reach the ranch house and was pounding on the front door. "Whitmore, you in there? We need to ford up before they overrun us." Thad looked at Running Bear, who was barely staying upright but whose eyes burned with desperate determination. "There's still time," the young Apache said. "If I can reach my father before the soldiers charge, you'll never make it across that open ground. Not wounded like you are. Then we need another way." Running Bear's gaze fell on something behind Thad, and his eyes widened. The water tower. Thad turned to look. His ranch's wooden water tower stood 30 feet high, positioned halfway between the house and the main battlefield. From up there, a man could be seen by all 3 groups simultaneously. "You want to climb up there and wave a white flag? They'll use you for target practice." "Not white flag." Running Bear pulled the photograph from his shirt, holding it up so the morning sun caught the image. "This. My father will recognize it, even from distance. And your colonel, he will see Apache warrior trying to make peace, not war." It was insane. The water tower offered no protection, and getting up there would put them in full view of every gun on the battlefield. But it was also the only position where they could be seen by everyone at once. Colonel Hayes was maybe 2 minutes from charging the Apache line. Chief Running Elk's warriors had arrows nocked and ready. Sheriff Dalton's men were taking positions around the ranch buildings, preparing for a siege. "I'll go," Thad said suddenly. "I'll carry the photograph up there. You're too weak to climb, and if someone takes a shot at me, at least you'll still be alive to explain what really happened." "No." Running Bear grabbed his arm. "Must be me. Must be Chief's son. You just white rancher to them. They not listen." Through the front window of the house, Sheriff Dalton was gesturing frantically for them to come inside. From the north, Colonel Hayes had raised his saber, preparing to signal the charge. And from the ridgeline, Chief Running Elk was pulling back his bowstring, sighting down the shaft of a war arrow. Time was running out. Thad made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or get them both killed in the next 60 seconds. If you're enjoying this story and want to see how it ends, hit that subscribe button because this next part will change everything you think you know about courage. "We go together," he said, grabbing Running Bear around the waist and half carrying him toward the water tower. "You hold that photograph high, and I'll make sure you don't fall." But as they started across the open ground between the barn and the tower, a rifle cracked from the rocks. The bullet whined past Thad's ear so close he felt the heat of it. Someone in the cavalry patrol thought they were making a run for it and had decided to stop them. But instead of hitting the dirt like any sane man would do, Thad kept moving toward the water tower, dragging Running Bear with him. "They're shooting at us!" Running Bear gasped, blood from his wounds leaving a trail in the dust behind them. "Let them," Thad growled. "Maybe that'll get everyone's attention." More shots followed, kicking up dirt around their feet. But something strange was happening. Instead of more gunfire, the shooting was actually stopping. All three groups had noticed the wounded Apache and the limping white rancher stumbling across the battlefield together, and the sheer unexpectedness of it was making everyone pause. They reached the base of the water tower just as Colonel Hayes's bugle sounded again. Not a charge this time, but a hold position. Through the ladder rungs, Thad could see the colonel had his field glasses trained on them, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. "Can you climb?" Thad asked. Running Bear looked up at the 30-foot ladder, then at his blood-soaked shirt. "Have to." They started up together, Thad below to catch Running Bear if he fell, the young Apache above him moving one painful rung at a time. Each step sent fresh blood dripping down onto Thad's hands, but Running Bear kept climbing. Halfway up, Running Bear's strength gave out. His hand slipped from the rungs and he started to fall backward, but Thad caught him, pressing him against the ladder with his own body. "I've got you, son," Thad whispered. "Just a little further." "Why?" Running Bear asked, his voice weak. "Why you risk everything for enemy?" Thad thought about that as they resumed climbing. "Maybe because you're not my enemy. Maybe because your mother was right. Love can exist between our peoples. Or maybe because I'm just too damn stubborn to let good men die over a misunderstanding." They reached the top platform of the water tower as the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the desert battlefield. From up here, Thad could see everything. Chief Running Elk and his warriors spread along the ridge, Colonel Hayes's cavalry in formation, Sheriff Dalton's men positioned around the ranch buildings, and the trapped patrol in the rocks where this whole mess had started. Every gun on the battlefield was pointed in their direction now. Running Bear pulled out the photograph, his hands shaking from blood loss and exhaustion. But his voice when he called out across the desert was strong and clear. "My father," he shouted in Apache, then repeated it in English. "Father, I live. I am safe." The effect was immediate. Chief Running Elk lowered his bow, his war paint unable to hide the shock and relief on his face. He urged his horse forward, close enough to see clearly, and when he recognized his son standing on the water tower, he let out a cry that was part anguish, part joy. But Colonel Hayes was also moving forward, and his expression was very different. Through the field glasses hanging around Thad's neck, he could see suspicion and anger on the officer's face. The colonel probably thought this was some kind of Apache trick, a wounded warrior being used as a human shield. "Colonel Hayes," Thad shouted, his voice carrying across the desert. "This man is Chief Running Elk's son. He was coming to meet with you for peace talks when bandits shot him. I found him dying and brought him to my ranch to save his life." The colonel reined in his horse, close enough now that they could see each other's faces clearly. "Whitmore. Thaddeus Whitmore." Thad was surprised the colonel knew his name, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. 3rd Cavalry, Colorado Territory. Discharged 1868. Something in Colonel Hayes's posture changed. He'd served with enough veterans to recognize one of his own, but he was still suspicious. "If that's true, why are there 300 Apache warriors surrounding your ranch?" Running Bear held up the photograph, the image catching the sunlight. "Because they came looking for me, Colonel. My father thought white men had killed his son during peace mission. He came here for war, but found this." Chief Running Elk had ridden close enough to see the photograph clearly. When he recognized the image of his beloved wife and young son, his expression crumbled. The war paint couldn't hide the tears that began streaming down his weathered face. The old chief dismounted and walked to the base of the water tower. Looking up at his son, he spoke in Apache, his voice breaking with emotion. "What's he saying?" Thad asked. "He says he thought he had lost me like he lost my mother. He says he came here to burn the world in revenge, but instead found that there are still white men with honor." Colonel Hayes had heard enough. He holstered his saber and rode forward, stopping halfway between his cavalry line and Chief Running Elk's position. "Chief," he called out, "I believe we have some talking to do." But just as it seemed like peace might be possible, Sheriff Dalton chose that moment to make the worst decision of his life. Sheriff Dalton burst out of the ranch house with his rifle raised, pointing it directly at Chief Running Elk. "Don't you move, you red devil! This is a trap and I won't stand for it." The peaceful moment shattered like glass. Apache warriors immediately raised their weapons, Colonel Hayes shouted orders to his men, and suddenly everyone was back to aiming guns at each other. "Dalton, no!" Thad yelled from the water tower. "Stand down!" But the sheriff was beyond reason. Fear and years of hatred had taken over. "That Apache killed the Morrison boy's father last month. I don't care if he's here for peace talks. He's a murderer." Chief Running Elk's hand moved to his tomahawk, his moment of emotional vulnerability replaced by cold anger. The other Apache warriors began moving forward, and Colonel Hayes was forced to raise his saber again, preparing to defend the sheriff whether he agreed with him or not. Running Bear swayed on the platform, his strength almost gone, but he managed to shout down to his father in Apache. Whatever he said made the chief pause, his hand freezing on his weapon. "What did you tell him?" Thad asked. "I told him that if blood is spilled now, my mother's spirit will never forgive him, that she believed in peace between our peoples and her son still believes." Chief Running Elk looked up at the water tower, then at Sheriff Dalton, then at Colonel Hayes. For a long moment, the fate of hundreds of lives hung in the balance. Then the old chief did something that surprised everyone. He dropped his tomahawk in the dust and walked slowly toward Sheriff Dalton, his hands empty and visible. "You speak of Morrison," the chief said in careful English. "I know this name. Young warrior from my band, he kill white farmer. But this warrior, he not listen to chief. He act alone against my orders. I bring you his head if you want justice." Sheriff Dalton's rifle wavered. This wasn't what he'd expected. You'd turn over one of your own? For peace, yes. My son teach me that some things worth more than revenge. Colonel Hayes dismounted and walked forward, positioning himself between the two men. "Sheriff, lower your weapon. Chief Running Elk, I appreciate your offer, but under the terms of our proposed treaty, we'll handle justice through proper channels." Running Bear was fading fast, but he managed to pull Thad's attention to something happening on the horizon. "Look," he whispered. "More riders." Thad raised the field glasses and felt his stomach drop. Another group was approaching from the east, but these weren't cavalry or townspeople. They were Apache, but from a different band. War paint, weapons ready, and riding hard toward the gathering. "Mescalero," Running Bear breathed. "My father's allies. They come because they heard war drums this morning." The approaching warriors numbered at least 100, and from their formation and paint, they were coming for battle, not negotiation. They'd heard the drums, seen the smoke from the gunfire, and assumed the peace talks had failed, and war had begun. Chief Running Elk saw them too, and immediately mounted his horse. He began riding toward the approaching Mescalero band, shouting orders in Apache, trying to stop them before they attacked. But the Mescalero warriors couldn't hear him over the thunder of their horses' hooves, and they were spread out too wide to stop quickly. In less than 2 minutes, they would hit Colonel Hayes' cavalry line like a thunderbolt. "We have to get down from here," Thad said. But Running Bear was unconscious now, finally succumbing to blood loss and exhaustion. Down below, chaos was erupting again. Colonel Hayes was shouting orders, trying to get his men into defensive positions. Sheriff Dalton was yelling for his deputies to take cover, and somewhere in the distance, the war cries of 100 Mescalero warriors grew louder with each passing second. Thad looked at the unconscious young Apache in his arms, then at the photograph still clutched in Running Bear's hand. Everything they'd accomplished, all the understanding they'd built between the groups, was about to be destroyed by warriors who didn't know that peace was possible, unless someone could reach the Mescalero in time to tell them the truth. Thad made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. He picked up Running Bear and started down the ladder, moving as fast as he dared with the unconscious young man slung over his shoulder. When he reached the ground, Chief Running Elk was riding back toward them, his face grim. "Cannot stop them," he said. "Too far, too fast." "Maybe you can't," Thad said, "but maybe someone else can." Colonel Hayes spurred his horse toward Thad and Chief Running Elk. "What do you have in mind, Whitmore?" "A cavalry charge," Thad said, gently laying Running Bear in the shade of the water tower. "But not to attack, to intercept. You and the chief ride together toward the Mescalero. When they see an Apache chief and a cavalry colonel side by side, not fighting but riding together, it might make them pause long enough to listen." Sheriff Dalton had joined them, his rifle finally lowered. "That's suicide. Those warriors are worked up for battle. They'll cut you down before you get within shouting distance." Chief Running Elk looked at his unconscious son, then at the approaching dust cloud. "Is good plan, but dangerous for white soldier. Dangerous for all of us," Colonel Hayes replied. "But it's better than the alternative." He turned to his men. Lieutenant Morrison, you're in command. If this goes badly, retreat to the ranch buildings and hold position until reinforcements arrive. Sir, I can't let you ride out there alone. I won't be alone. Hayes looked at Chief Running Elk. Will you ride with me, Chief? The old Apache nodded solemnly. For my son. For peace. They mounted their horses and rode out together. The grizzled cavalry colonel and the painted Apache chief, two old warriors who'd spent decades fighting each other, now united in trying to prevent a massacre. Thad watched them disappear into the dust cloud, then knelt beside Running Bear. The young man's breathing was shallow but steady. The photograph was still clutched in his hand. Come on, boy, Thad whispered. Don't die on me now. Your father's going to need you to help translate when this is all over. The sound of the approaching Mescalero war party suddenly changed. The thunder of hooves was slowing, and the war cries were becoming confused shouts. Through his field glasses, Thad could see Hayes and Chief Running Elk in the middle of the Mescalero formation, both men gesturing toward the ranch and speaking rapidly. It seemed to be working. The warriors were reining in their horses, weapons lowering as they listened to their chief's ally explain the situation. But it was a delicate moment. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture could still turn this into a bloodbath. Sheriff Dalton sat down heavily beside Thad. Never thought I'd see the day when I'd be hoping for Apache warriors to make the right choice. People change, Thad said. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to show them a different way. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the group of riders began moving back toward the ranch. Hayes and Chief Running Elk rode at the front, followed by the Mescalero war leader and his lieutenants. The rest of the warriors had spread out in a loose formation that looked more like an escort than an attack force. When they reached the ranch, Chief Running Elk immediately dismounted and knelt beside his son. Running Bear's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw his father's face, he managed a weak smile. It is done, my son, the chief said in English, wanting everyone to understand. Peace is made. Your mother would be proud. Colonel Hayes dismounted and approached Thad. Whitmore, what you did today, it took courage. Real courage. If you ever want to rejoin the service, I'd be honored to have you in my command. Thad shook his head. Thank you, Colonel, but I think I'll stick to ranching. Though I suspect I'm going to have some interesting neighbors from now on. Chief Running Elk looked up from his son. You saved Running Bear's life. Apache people do not forget such things. This ranch, this land, it is under our protection now. Any man who threaten you, threaten us. Over the next hour, the three groups worked together to tend the wounded and establish the framework for a lasting peace treaty. The trapped cavalry patrol was freed from the rocks. Sheriff Dalton's wounded deputy was treated by an Apache medicine man, and Running Bear was made comfortable in Thad's own bed while his wounds finished healing. As the sun reached its peak, Colonel Hayes and Chief Running Elk signed a preliminary treaty that would end the fighting between their peoples. The Mescalero leaders added their marks to the document, and even Sheriff Dalton grudgingly agreed to respect Apache territorial boundaries in exchange for protection of white settlements. 3 months later, Thad's ranch had become an unofficial meeting ground where Apache and white families could trade peacefully. Running Bear, fully recovered from his wounds, served as translator and liaison between the communities. The photograph of his mother was framed and hung in Thad's cabin, a reminder that love and understanding could indeed exist between different peoples. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind carried the sound of Apache children playing near the creek, Thad would sit on his porch and remember the day when a single act of compassion had prevented a war and changed the lives of everyone involved. The bitter rancher who had saved an enemy's life discovered that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting, but in choosing to heal instead of harm. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, hit that subscribe button because we have more incredible tales from the American frontier that will leave you amazed. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.